Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jordan Schroeder. Can we be mature about this? The other presentation is how to kill people by using the internet. And I can definitely understand why a talk about maturity models might not quite compete with that, but we'll try to keep it at least interesting so that we precious few can have some fun in the next 45 minutes. This is the second time speaking at BSides Scotland. I'm very honored to be talking here again. My previous talk was entitled "How to Get Your Users to Give Up Sex for a Year." And I decided to switch things up and talk about maturity, hence my maturity suit. I didn't want to be known as the sex guy. Professionally, that's not going to really work for me. Personally, eyebrow waggle. But I just wanted to switch things up this year. My name is Jordan Schroeder, by the way, and some housekeeping right off the bat. The accent, Canadian. That means if you can't understand what I'm saying, just ask me to repeat myself and I'll apologize 5 times. Who am I and what do I do? Well, I've done a lot in security. I am currently one of the moderators for Information Security Stack Exchange. There's another moderator here at BSides as well. And if you're not part of Information Security Stack Exchange, please join. We've got lots of fun and games happening there. I'm also the author of Advanced Persistent Training, how to take your security awareness program to the next level. I've done a lot of other stuff in inventing programs for security awareness, for phishing, and developed the world's most advanced phishing engine as well. So I keep my hand in a lot of things in security. But my career hasn't been entirely centered around security. For instance, I've picked some highlights from my CV. I've been a Coast Guard officer, a stage actor and director, a college department head, a network admin for a major network doing research into DDoS before it was known as DDoS. I've been a day trader, an undertaker, a tax preparer, and a dungeon master. And when I present this list, someone always raises their hand and wants to ask a question about one of the items on this list. And let me just say, when I say dungeon master, that's the roll the dice and eat pizza type of dungeon master, not the whips and chains dungeon master. And that's the one that everyone talks about. All right. So I've done all these things in security, and I've had outside of security and within security, but most recently I was presented with a very interesting job opportunity. And I want to know what you would think and how you would respond to such an offer. The offer came to me as there is a deputy CISO position open for a university and college's shared services. That means that you would be in charge of security strategy for 20 universities and colleges, all at the same time. Some of the universities are over 500 years old and represent some of the oldest parts of the internet and haven't been updated much. Some of the universities have multiple Class B IP addresses, which means that every single node and a device within the network is given a publicly routable IP, including printers, servers, user devices, and student devices. They have global campuses around the world and research partners in areas of the world where a lot of other organizations was just simply a geo IP address block just because they don't want to have to deal with the hassle. And IT is also not entirely centrally managed. The core of it is, but there's a lot of schools and separate research departments and other areas that they run themselves and they just use the school's IT infrastructure as basically an ISP. And they have ethical hacking programs, so we're actually weaponizing the students in order to hack and cause problems on the network. And one of the core features and one of the most critical things that some of the universities do is engage in sensitive research with significance to national security. Oh yes, could you please prepare them for Cyber Essentials and GDPR? You're going to be the person who is ultimately responsible for the security strategy in these situations. The service model that we're using, where we'd lump everybody together and share information security strategy and leadership across such a large swath, has never been tried before anywhere in the world. And we consider this a greenfield opportunity, which is code word for, we've not prepared anything, please make it up as you go along. Show of hands. How many of you would say yes to this opportunity? Ooh, one brave, four brave souls. I was presented with this opportunity, and one thing kept running through my mind. Just one thing. Gimli. Certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for? So I joined the team under Chris Sutherland. For those of you who don't know, it's the man in red. He was the lead CISO and brought me into the organization. And so one of the things that we needed to do in being presented with these organizations with the challenges that I've just described is the same types of things we'd want to do if you were brought in as a security manager, security leader, a CISO for a new organization. How many of you know, or how many of you have an idea of the two major high-level goals that you would want to accomplish within the first 60 days if you were dropped in as a security leader for an organization? First 60 days, what's the goals? Any ideas? Yeah, well, that's a sub-goal. That's absolutely a sub-goal. Anybody else? What do you want to do? What do you want to need to be able to deliver? Well, what you want to be able to deliver within the first 60 days, as soon as you've dropped into a security leadership position, is you need to be able to do an inventory and a baseline. If you're interviewing, these are the two things you want to be able to say. You need to do an inventory, not just of the things, the devices, the security technologies, and the people, but you need to do an inventory of the risks, you need to do an inventory of the processes, you need to do an inventory of the decision makers, and then the real decision makers, and then the things that you need to get done and the goals of the organization. Broad inventory, and then you need to do a baseline for the organization. You need to figure out what's normal, what's not normal, and what the normal needs to be. So an inventory and a baseline. Basic high-level things. Baselining, pardon me, need to adjust this. Baselining for us, for what we wanted to accomplish, looked at two things. Pardon me, fighting with the cable. There we go. We wanted to take a look at two things, risk analysis and controls assessment. Now, the risk analysis part, I could do an entire presentation on that alone, so I'm going to set that aside. But suffice it to say that after the risk analysis, we had a good understanding of the impacts to the data for the organization. We then needed to take a look at the controls assessment and baseline the controls. Pretty standard stuff, nothing too grand or glorious here. But the challenge for us is that we needed to do it at scale. We needed to develop a process to do a baseline across everybody, times 20. So that means it needed to be fast, it needed to be comparable across all the different members, and it also needed to result in actions. This wasn't an academic exercise, even though we were dealing with academic institutions. This needed to result in something real for the organization. Just like we heard before, what we needed to produce needed to address their anxieties, and it needed to communicate faith in the vision for what was to come. And that was our goal, and that was our challenge. Okay, so the control assessments. And this is where we employed a maturity model approach. And this is where we wanted to raise the maturity of all of our members. But why maturity? Why were we focused on maturity? We have the impact ratings for the different data sets and the different risks. We had those impact ratings, and we had also identified the fragile assets. And those are those data assets and those risks that hit a critical or sensitive level at really, really low volumes or really, really soon within the process. So we have identified all these things. We understood what the organization's risks were. And we then need to baseline the controls in a cybersecurity risk context. All right. Risk equals likelihood times impact. How many of you have not seen this formula before? Raise your hands. Raise your hands. Raise your hands. Okay. That informs me as to how deep I need to go into this. Apparently not that deep. We can catch up afterwards, and I can talk to you about this later. All right. Risk equals likelihood and impact. Yes, there's some other formulas and some other ways of describing this, but this is the basic one, and I'll use this as the touchstone because everyone knows it. Is this a formula? No. This is a description of a relationship. It happens to have an equal sign in it, but it's not a formula. Don't plug numbers into this, even if they have decimal points, and assume you're doing proper maths. You're not. It's just a description of a relationship. It's a rule of thumb. Let's move on. When we're doing a controls assessment, we want a baseline. We're not baselining the risks. We're baselining the mitigations. The controls are mitigations against the risks, right? So if we want to assess the baseline of the firewalls is a mitigation. Right, fine. So then we bring in one of the adjustments to this formula, which is risk equals likelihood times impact less the mitigations. And this is known as, what kind of risk? Thank you very much. The residual risk. The risk you have left over after you have the mitigations. So what we were interested in communicating and analyzing for our institutions was what the residual risk was after the mitigations were in place. And we wanted to know whether or not the mitigations were at the appropriate level to drop the residual risk to a level that was appropriate for the organization. That's what we wanted to do. Okay. Here's the problem. I've done a lot of writing on this. I've done lots of presentations on this. It has to do with the problem of likelihood. What is the likelihood that you're going to get hit with for instance, a virus within the next 2 years? Probably pretty close to 100% within the next 2 years. Sure. What's the likelihood that your IDS is not going to catch something? It's going to approach 100%. No matter what the risk is, when it comes to cybersecurity, likelihood starts to approach 100% really, really, really fast. Because it's not about the technology, it's about people. It's about the attackers, and it's about the people within the organizations that are doing work. So what's the likelihood that a user is going to cause an error? What's the likelihood that a user is going to circumvent your technical controls? The curve starts to reach pretty close to 100%, and it's basically just up to the will of the people involved to do or not do. Once you start running that calculation, again, the curve starts getting really, really close to 100%. How do you represent 100% as an integer in a formula? Go for it. 1. Right? That's how you do the math with 100%. It's a 1. Great. What's 1 times any number? Any number. Right. So we could potentially just drop likelihood from the formula altogether, given the assumption that likelihood is pretty close or equivalent to 1, which leaves us with this formula. Boy, I bet you're wishing you were at the death by internet right now. You're going to go into a math lesson. All right. Going through this quickly to understand why we're going through maturity models. So residual risk is impact minus the mitigations, given the assumption that likelihood approaches 1. Okay. Now, what are mitigations? Let's talk about antivirus solution. That's great. Antivirus solution is not a mitigation. It is a tool for mitigation. How many of you heard this phrase? You can't buy your way to security. You can't just buy kit, throw it in your network, and woohoo, risks are mitigated. Nope. Security is a process, which means that the mitigations are also a process. So we wanted to do an assessment not on the technical mitigations, not on the kit, because there's not a lot of usefulness in that. We wanted to take a look at residual risk being a function of impact mitigated by process and process maturity. Now let's test this theory. Let's test this idea. We can assume that an immature process is going to be less effective against a risk as opposed to a mature process affecting a risk. So the more mature the process is around the mitigation, the higher the likelihood is that it's actually going to have a positive impact on reducing the residual risk. So this is why we looked at maturity, and this was Chris Sutherland's approach, and he's used this before in other high-risk areas. Back to the controls assessment. NIST CSF, if you haven't seen it, is a really, really useful tool. What we didn't want to do, because remember, one of the goals that we had is our controls assessment needed to be, and our baselining needed to be comparable across all the member institutions. So we didn't want to have a situation where we would drop into an institution, enumerate what they had, and then try to compare that with what other people had. We wanted to come in with a prescriptive list. This is the things that we're going to compare you against. And this cybersecurity framework, it works really, really well for this. There are 98 cybersecurity activities in version 1. They just released version 1.1 this last week. We've got 98 cybersecurity activities and controls broken up on 5 different areas: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. How many of you have not run into the NIST cybersecurity framework? How many of you don't know what this is? Oh, good. Most of you, no, some of you don't. All right. So this is really, it's just a list broken up by category. And this is a really, really great idea. We love this. One of the other things that the CSF can do is it's mappable to other frameworks. Maps exist to a whole bunch of other frameworks. So if we had an organization that wanted to use ISO 27000, if they wanted to use Cyber Essentials, we could then map everything to this one master list. And then from institution to institution, we could also map against the same static list. This worked really, really well for us. And this is an example of some of the activities. These are taken from different areas. Some of the descriptions get really long, so I chose the really, really short ones. Physical devices and systems are inventoried. This is the first on the framework. I think it's probably the most important, because if you don't know what you're protecting, you don't know what you're protecting. You've got all users are informed and trained, so you've got a managerial type controls. Impact of events is determined. You've got these conceptual type controls, and forensics are performed. So very, very technical things being listed in the framework as well. So these are the types of things that we had. Now what we needed to do is to assign maturity levels to each one of these activities. And this was fairly straightforward. What we did is we took a look at the CMMI, control maturity framework that's really well known for software development, and I refined it for cybersecurity controls. And this is what I came up with. Maturity level 0, it's not done. There was one organization which caused me to come up with 0 because most everybody else was doing everything, at least at some point. There was one organization where there was one thing where they just simply didn't do it. So luckily there was only the one instance. So I had to include a 0 not done. Maturity level 1 defined. The process is defined by the individuals. This is where either the users do what they're supposed to do because they know they're supposed to do it or they care about it, or there is a cybersecurity person who is tasked with this one thing and they just do it. Maturity level 2, the process is defined and important to the group or the team. So everything is defined by the team, which means that if one person isn't doing it, someone else in the team is going to fill that gap, and there's some normalization of the processes within the team. Okay, pretty standard. 3, the process is defined by the organization, and important to the organization at an organizational level. Okay, so this is where you get policies, official policies and procedures and guidelines and that sort of information defined at a high level pushed to the organization, to the rest of the organization. The other thing that I put in here for maturity level 3 is if it is truly fully automated. This is where you actually drop in Kit and it just works and it does its thing and it connects with everything else in order to do its job. So if it was fully automated, maturity level 3, because it's basically the same type of idea as if the organization had defined it themselves. Maturity level 4, same as maturity level 3, except it is also audited. It creates artifacts that are checked to make sure the process is working. At maturity level 5, it is audited and improved. It's on an improving cycle. All right. Pretty straightforward, pretty clear. Haven't blown anyone's mind. All right. Lessons learned. I'm halfway through, and I'm already hopping onto the lessons learned stage. But I wanted to do this here because there's a couple of reasons why. Because that'll become evident in a second. Lessons learned about using maturity levels in order to assess security controls. These were really, really surprising to me, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this presentation and pass this on to you. By assessing by maturity levels, you get the strength and the simplicity of a checklist with a better reflection of reality. Do you have antivirus? Check, right? No one wants that. No one wants that, but there's power in knowing that, yes, we have an antivirus solution. But maturity level tells us, yes, we have an antivirus solution, and this is how we're using it. We're using it in this way. The maturity levels and the numbers make it very, very simple to assess and to communicate out. The other thing that I have found in using maturity levels is that evaluating controls on maturity levels is really, really, really difficult to argue with. Do you have an IDS solution? Yes. Great. Who administers it? I do. Great. Who else? No one. Okay. Is anyone else trained to do it? No. Okay, no problem. But it's really, really effective. We've been able to catch this. That's awesome. That's great. I'm really glad we're doing that. That's a win for your organization. That's maturity level 1, right? Because it's just you. What happens if you get hit by a bus? And so invariably the conversation would go, maybe I should train someone else in doing that. Great. There was no argument about the level of maturity because it's defined as reality. And it's not subjective as to effectiveness, and it's not impinging upon the professionalism of the people involved because it's not based on effectiveness. This is the weakness of this model and the power. We're not measuring the effectiveness of the controls. We're measuring the effectiveness of the controls around the controls. In order to boost the effectiveness of an ineffective, mature control, you typically need to make tiny tweaks because the process is mature enough to absorb them and move them forward successfully. If you have an immature process and you need to make it more effective, that's a really, really, really hard job. So we're not measuring effectiveness, we're still measuring the maturity level. Effectiveness comes later. Talk about that. All right, so this is an example of my first report. I walked in the organization with the NIST CSF, everything was great. I had all the activities and I did all the interviews and I talked to people and I assigned the maturity levels and we had funky discussions and everything was great. Really, really frictionless and easy process to do those interviews because, again, we weren't talking about effectiveness. Came up with my levels and presented it I'm going to give you an example. In one institution, it had a senior executive and the director of IT. Presented this, my full report, came to this, and here's your maturity assessment. And the senior exec freaked the hell out. I describe it in my memory. She started vibrating in her chair. She starts looking at the director of IT, shooting daggers out of her eyes. She's just starting to foam at the mouth. She's looking at me with just like complete despair, him with complete anger. And I'm like, whoa, hold on a sec, what's going on here? And she's like, I thought you told me that we were secure enough. I'm like, how did you get, what? She says, there's no 5s anywhere on this list. There's no 5s. How are we, the amount of cost and effort to get everything. I'm like, whoa, time out. Wait. Everything's not supposed to be a 5. It'd be great if everything was a 5, but that's not realistic. Everything's not supposed to be a 5. She's like, well, what's it supposed to be? I'm like, but I've done this assessment to give to you so that you can assess what the appropriate level of maturity is to address your residual risks. You need to do that balance. And she looked at me and said, but how am I supposed to know how that works? And I face-palmed so hard that I bruised myself. And I said, fair point. That's kind of my job, isn't it? He says, let me come back. I've got some ideas, let me come back. So with that, what I realized is that my maturity cycle needed some maturing. How many of you can name this TV character, by the way? How many of you can name that TV character? Yeah. The other North American in the room can name the character? All right. What was that? North American. Canadian. Just trying to be broad. I wasn't trying to out your nationality. GDPR, come on. Okay, so this is what I had. I had the assessments, I had the activities, and I had the maturity, and what I realized, I needed a target maturity level for each activity. What makes sense? Because, as I said, the first item, physical devices and systems are inventoried, is probably far more important and probably has a greater impact on risk than whether or not forensics are performed. Right? Because that's more foundational. Okay, so obviously things need to be different across the board. So I started trying to figure out what the target maturity per activity is per organization. Remember, I'm doing this for 20 organizations. I wanted to do the assessment based on the effect on the overall risk, which is more important in sort of ranking them. I also wanted to adjust the target maturity levels based on the size of the organization. If there's a massive organization with a complex IT structure, the maturity levels need to be greater because there's a greater chance for things to fall through the cracks. Complexity means too many bad things can be hidden. So the size of the organization boosts the target maturity level. A smaller organization, it's a lot harder to hide things. And also, I wanted to adjust it based on asset fragility. If there were assets that the organization had that were so fragile that they could not withstand even the slightest hint of risk, then the maturity levels also need to increase. Right? They need to increase to reduce the residual risk. All right. Now to do this, I needed to do this several times, so I worked out an algorithm between all of these things to determine what the level should be for each of the 96, and I just wrote a simple script to employ that algorithm. So great. Really, really simple. Toss it into a spreadsheet. Bob's your uncle. This is the second version of my report now. I have the activities, I have my assessed current level where they're at, and then my suggestion for their target maturity level. Great. Now this makes sense. I then go back to this organization, and I talk to the senior exec, and she's like, oh, well, that eases my anxieties. Okay, this makes a lot more sense. Okay, this is great. I like numbers that are close together. This is good. This is good. All right. But what does it mean that physical devices and systems are inventoried and it needs to be maturity level of 3? And I'm like, but that's what the maturity level thing is for. It's defined by the organization and or automated. Oh. But what does it actually look like? I'm like, huh. Please don't ask me to do this. Please don't ask me to do this. Please, I'm going to offer to do this anyway. I says, tell you what. Why don't I come back, write up what each of the maturity levels mean for each of these scenarios, so then you know what you're looking at. She said, that'd be great, thanks. I went, oh yeah. So then I went back home, and I started working on, for each of the maturity levels, for each of the items, what it would typically look like for an organization. That's, of course, maturity level 0, I didn't do anything, because it's not done. That means 5 times 100, that was 500 scenarios I wrote up for the report. And this is what I ended up with. This is like the first line for the physical inventory. So maturity level 1, ad hoc individual use of tools and processes. Maturity level 2, ad hoc team use of tools and processes. Maturity level 3, automation and regular use of tools and processes with documentation backed by established guidelines. Maturity level 4, and audited. Maturity level 5, and audited and systematic improvements based on KPIs. Tried to keep the language as generic as possible because I was really hoping to use the same thing a few times, and that worked, but not as often as I hoped. There was a lot of writing to be done, and rewriting and writing and editing. And that was a big chunk of work. But I did it. I got it all in, I then plugged it into my report, and so this is what I came back to the organization with and said, great, physical devices and systems are inventoried, you're at a level 1, you need to be level 3, and this is what level 3 looks like. Great. She says, lovely, this makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I can see that. Here, Director of IT, make that happen. Okay, good, right. We have buy-in, everything makes sense. I've spoken to the anxieties, there's faith in the process, and at a gut level, it makes sense. Beautiful. According to Cotter, good communication. And then I had a thought. I'm going, so this is showed it to the senior execs, that's great. It's now being handed to the director of IT to be actioned. Remember, one of the things is that it needs to be actionable. Great, that's lovely. But I bet we've got a better idea here. I think I know how to improve this entire process. What are the things they should be tackling first? There's 100 items. What are we tackling first? The things with the biggest gaps, right? If there's a 1 and it's supposed to be a 4, that's a gap of 3, we should be doing those first, right? Right, sure, great. So in my report, it should be really, really simple to add a column. A priority column, which is basically the target minus the current. Sort the entire thing by priority, and guess what you get? An action plan. An action plan that's based on the priority with a target state. This is what you should end up with, which means it's really, really easy for the director of IT or the networking folks to implement because they know what it's supposed to look like from a procedural level. Yay. So what did I end up creating? I'm stepping back on this whole thing. I'm going, wait a minute, we started off with just trying to assess the baseline of the controls based on maturity levels, but what have I created? This is now looking very, very different from what I started with. What I ended up creating, and this is what I realized, is a prescriptive process maturity requirement approach. This is what you should look like. And I had a tool set to do it. My little spreadsheet that I worked up had all the formulas in it and had all the content. It just needed to put in whatever the current assessment level was. That's great. So now we have a tool set and an approach. It's not just an assessment approach, but it's prescriptive. This is what you should look like. And then this is how you get there. So the whole was looking a lot bigger than the sum of the parts. And it comes with a whole bunch of inherent bonuses, including strategic objectives. What's the security strategy objective then in using this tool? Reaching an appropriate maturity level for each of your controls. That becomes your security strategy. It's got a built-in gap analysis, a built-in action plan, and it's contained in a simple spreadsheet. I started getting so excited about this that I started socializing this with other people, including the public sector here in Scotland, and they're like, this is brilliant, we love this. And so they started using it too. All in all, it was really, really, really effective in working with the organizations. The entire thing is easy to understand at a gut level. It's easy to communicate to senior management. Again, we've got numbers that are compared and prioritized, and everything's great. And at a gut level, they can take a look at the scenario, what the levels look like, and they go, yeah, sure, that makes sense. It's really easy to start working on because it doesn't rely on buying more kit. Yes, technology can help you fill in the gaps, but that's only if you have a mature process that can handle the technology. If you don't have the people and training and the bandwidth to handle the technology, buying new technology isn't going to help. So, what the action plan doesn't result in, and we need you to buy all of these things. After an analysis and talking with them, they come to a conclusion that, yeah, okay, in order to make it to this maturity level, we probably need to buy a couple more things. Okay, that's great, but my action plan didn't say that. They said that as an assessment in order to reach the goals. This was a huge win. Overall, in speaking with the technicians, the directors of ITs, and the senior executives, the entire thing was frictionless and tension-free. And that was a huge surprise. It was a win for everybody involved. But wait, there's more. I looked at the maturity level definitions because the reason I did this is because I'd done the assessments and people wanted to know what the target maturity looked like. And so I created the 500 scenarios. Okay. And then I went to a member institution for whom I had not done an assessment. I'm going, okay, and like, oh yeah, I've got these scenarios. So I started comparing what they've got with my scenarios, And then it hit me like a ton of bricks and a lightning rod, and I went, oh my God, I totally missed this fact. It's self-assessable. I didn't have to be involved because the scenarios were so defined and people weren't arguing with them and it wasn't subjective but objective based on what people were actually doing. I could hand it to the director of IT and said, here, do you want to do it? You can do it. You want me to do it? I can do it, but you can do it too. I've had a couple directors of IT say, yeah, it'll be a lot simpler for me to do it because it's all defined here. Great. And then one of the directors of IT said, I could hand this to one of my schools that I don't control and get them to do it. I'm like, yeah, that's brilliant. Do that. That'd be perfect. So embedded in all this is the fact that people can be doing this themselves, and also, more importantly, they can repeat it on a quarterly, yearly basis for whatever they need, whatever they want. So this was brilliant. And then that one institution, there's always one, right, was working with this one institution, and they're probably the strangest of everyone in Scotland. They have a really, really, really small IT team, and they've been working together for 15 years. This means that nothing is documented. Nothing's documented. There's very few policies and procedures. There's very few guidelines because the team just knows what to do because they've been doing it for 15 years. So I'm like, okay, technically, your maturity level is 1. But the organization is gaining a benefit of a much, 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 much higher maturity level. So I added a column to my report called equivalent maturity. The maturity level was 1, but the organization was gaining a maturity level of 4. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but the organization needs to know about this disparity. And so I added another column to if I was using equivalent maturity, that the organization should know that the maturity level is at risk. If the team changes, or if the one person who has been doing that for 10 years leaves, the organization needs to know that there's going to be an impact. Does that mean the organization needs to do something right now in order to fix it? No. Well, typically what needs to happen is just needs to be some documentation and some cross-training involved. And that's it. So it's a really, really easy thing to correct. It just needs to be noted. Great. So this meant that I've got a much, much easier process for some of these older teams and these older organizations. So, after all of this and all these iterations in my slowly maturing process, and as soon as I stopped face-bombing myself, this is what my report now looks like. The activity, the currently assessed maturity level, whatever the exceptional equivalent maturity levels are for the organization, what I believe, based on my algorithm, what the target maturity level ought to be, a priority, which is the difference, sorted by priority, notes if any of the maturity levels are at risk, and then, of course, I didn't have those on this slide, or else it'd be really tiny, the description of what the target maturity state should be. And this was really, really, really exciting because it was actionable, workable, and everybody understood it. All right, summary. Why maturity? Because residual risk equals impact minus mitigations, given that likelihood probably approaches 1. But mitigations aren't just kit, they're about people and they're about processes. So let's assess the process maturity and what people are doing around those mitigations. Maturity offers us the power of checklists without actually hiding reality, and maturity levels are really, 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 really difficult to argue with. And lastly, a mature process is easy to tweak to make more effective. So we're not checking effectiveness, we want to check the maturity. Effectiveness comes later. What I created in this process is a prescriptive process maturity requirement approach and toolset. Really, really simple spreadsheet. It is both strategic, tactical, and risk-informed. It's got a built-in action plan. Oops. It's based on international standards, NIST CSF, and is mapped to multiple other frameworks out there. It's scalable, which means we can do the entire organization, small parts, or even an individual system, and it's also self-assessable. If you want to do this, it is really, really simple. Here's your action plan. Take a look at NIST CSF, version 1.1 just came out this week. Define what the different maturity levels look like. Write the scenarios. Define the target maturity levels for your organization. Do the assessment, run a gap analysis, and prioritize. And you can get the same effect and the same ease and the same benefits out of the situation as well. Any questions? Oh, sure, clap. Yeah, a couple questions. Go ahead. Paul? No, Kevin? Oh, absolutely. The question is, with GDPR, is the requirement for forensics, does that need to be increased? Probably. What that's going to look like in practice is going to be up to the ICO and the capabilities of the organization. You can't have a small mom and pop being able to do forensics. If it's due care, then that's a balancing question that needs to be done per organization. But yeah, GDPR and the required maturity level for each of these things is up to the organization. Yeah. Yeah. And then you mix in Cyber Essentials. So Cyber Essentials has a bunch of requirements. They're mappable to NIST CSF, and there are a couple of things if you just want to add them. The thing with Cyber Essentials is that it is prescriptive technical specifications. So there are specific technical things that you need to be able to employ, which means it's not necessarily mappable to maturity, but it ought to be, but it's not. All right. I was anticipating this question. My answer is no. What you need to do is take a photo of this slide. Grab the activities. The current equivalent is done at assessment time. You calculate the target based on your organization. Priority and at risk are simple spreadsheet formulas. Sort by priority. Add in the relevant descriptions into the spreadsheet. Bob's your uncle. Again, I'm just shocked at how effective this has been in raising the security standard and the strategy for our organizations. All right? We're done with questions? Any other questions? Yeah. Yep, sure. I'm not talking with security professionals. I'm the CISO. If I say likelihood approaches 100%, or equivalent to 100%, because the likelihood is completely undeterminable, uncalculable, or over a 2-year time span, because that's what's going to be required in order to put in other mitigations, it says it's going to approach like 100%, which means it's 1. It's 1. I can have that debate with security professionals. I've written papers and done a lot of presentations on this particular topic, and I'm happy to talk about that, and I can talk about that with authority. Is it a debate? Sure. Is it a useful debate? No. In the end, it's not a useful debate. You want to tell me that because you want to debate what the likelihood amount is, that you want to reduce the maturity in a security process? Is that what you really want to tell me? You really want to debate for less security? Well, okay, sure. No, I'm.
Hey guys, sorry, I got to jump in, but in
Okay.
the interest of time, there's a bar, there's a pub, there's a lobby. If you like whiskey.
Yes, whiskey, not beer. Thank you. Thank you very much.